All right, welcome back. So today we're going to continue our discussion on loops, but instead of talking about while loops, we're going to talk about for loops, a different kind of loop. And it's a loop that I actually tend to use more often. I think most people tend to use for loops more often than while loops. And so let's go ahead and get started. And so just a reminder, why are loops useful to us? Well, a loop allows us to do the same thing multiple times. Maybe there's one small change, in every time that code runs, but it allows us to do something kind of over and over again without us having to write many more lines of code, right? So let's say an example I think I gave last time was if I asked you to draw 1,000 circles on the screen, where you could have, 1,000 circle commands, you could have 1,000, variables for the x of each circle, 1,000 variables for the y's of each circle. But it's just a ton of work and it's not really useful or fun work. It's just kind of tedious garbage, right? And so we can just, instead of doing that, we can just use loops to help us do that, right? Where we can just have a loop and say, hey, draw every time you're in the loop, draw a circle, but every time you're in the loop, also increase the x or something. And that would make a row of circles, something like that. So we talked about this already. We talked about while loops more specifically. Today we're going to build on that and talk about for loops. But first, let's go back and look at while loops and let's look at the basic parts you need for a loop. And so we're going to look at how these three parts kind of work with a while loop, which you've seen already. And then we'll talk about how these three parts are then connected to for loops instead. It's going to be structured a little bit differently. So let's go ahead and get started. So we have three parts. The first is the variable that's going to be used to kind of looped over. It needs to be given an initial value. So if we look at this kind of block of code here, which is something you've seen very similar already, something you've done already, except you did squares, is what do we have here? Well, we have a variable x. We start off as 0. We say while x is less than the width of the window, go ahead and, hey, draw a circle at position x and has this kind of hard-coded y in diameter, but then increase the x by 30, right? And so x starts off at 0, and then while it's less than the width, let's say the width is here, is going to draw a circle, increase by 30, draw a circle, increase by 30, draw a circle, do, until it reaches kind of this boundary where the width is, and then it's going to stop from there, right? And so the three parts that we kind of need here is we need the variable that we're going to loop over. In this case, it's the x variable that's being looped and changed every time. So this variable needs to be initialized to something. In this case, it's been initialized to 0. So that's this thing. So this is like number 1, right? The variable that's being initialized. Number 2 is the condition that we check. This condition, if it's true, we stay in the loop. If this condition is false, we leave the loop. We're not in the loop anymore. So where is that here? Well, that's going to be this bit. That's the condition. Number 2. So that's the condition. And then finally, we need the exit condition, or we need something to update the variable so we do not stay in the loop forever, so that it's not an infinite loop. So where is that? Well, that is this bit right here. So that's number 3. And of course, you will almost always have some code that needs to be run within the loop, and that's like this. But technically, you don't need that to have the loop to work. It just would be a pointless loop if you don't have that. But hopefully that makes sense. So our three things, the variables give an initial condition, initial value, that's here. Then we need to check a condition to see if it's true. If it is, we go into the loop. That's here. And then we need something to make sure we exit the loop. We're not stuck in an infinite loop. So in other words, we need to increment or change the variable in some way so we don't stay in the loop forever. That's this right here. And so we need to have those three things for a while loop, but also for a for loop, it turns out. It's just where these things will be written will be different for a for loop. And I would actually argue that the way the for loop handles it is better. It makes it less likely for there to be errors or problems. And so let's look at that. So a for loop, again, it's a loop. It does the same thing as a while loop. Anything that you can do with the while loop, you can do with the for loop. There's no difference in terms of the functionality of them. It's just different ways of writing it and different ways of thinking about them. So that being said, like I said before, I think for loops tend to be more useful. Like if I had to only use one loop ever, it would be a for loop. But for each kind of loop, there's kind of different situations where it'd make more sense to use a while loop versus a for loop. And we'll kind of play with that throughout this course. But yeah, in terms of what they do, though, they do the exact same thing. They just loop, and we'll do the same bit of code over and over again. And so the basic structure, and you'll see this written in code here in a second, but the basic structure is, we have 3 parts, right? So we had the variable, let's get an initial value, the condition that you need to check to see if it's true, and the variable needs to be updated. But if you look at the for loop, the way you write it is you write the word for, instead of while, you write the word for, parentheses, then you write where your variable should be initialized. This is the number 1. This is the thing we talked about here. This is this. That's this. This is this right here, exactly, this bit. The second thing is the condition to check. That's the second thing. So you have the first thing, semicolon, the condition to check. Notice that these are semicolons, not commas. And then you have another semicolon, and then we say how the variable was changed, how you increment it. So remember, those 3 things that we needed, that these 3 things, instead of having kind of spread out all throughout the loop, we just go ahead and say it all right at the beginning. We say, hey, here's the first thing I need, the initialization of my variable. Here's the condition I'm going to check, and here's the how I'm going to increment the variable. You just set it all right up front at the beginning of the for loop, and then you inside these brackets, inside your block of code, you just put whatever code you want to run, just straight up. So I really like that. And something you may notice, and we'll look at this here in the next slide, where I have a while loop and a for loop, which will do the exact same thing, but you just see they're written differently, but they will do the exact same thing. If we look at this, just to kind of clear this up, we need to initialize the variable. So there's like number 1. This goes straight here. Those match straight up 1-to-1. Now, if we look at this, though, you might say, hey, there's a bit of a difference here. In this case, I don't have int. Here I'm saying int x equals 0. Okay, let's talk about that. And so for this program right here, and this is pretty common with how you do a while loop, the variable has probably been declared up above, right? Somewhere higher in the program, I've written something like int x, where it's not been initialized, but it's just been, oh, excuse me, not equals, but int x semicolon, right? That's been done somewhere already. In fact, if you want, I can even bring back an old example where, this is just the one where it's just printing out the values of x over time. Well, what did I do? At the beginning, I just said int x. For a for loop, this variable that you have here does not need to be declared before the for loop. You can. It will work if you do it that way. But what you tend to do is you don't even declare the variable until you enter the for loop. So what that means is you need to both declare and initialize it. Well, that's why you need the int here. That declares it, and then you got to say it's equal to 0. That's the initialization part. And so that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So if you had just x equals 0, that would not work unless you had, int x up here at top, right? You had to declare it at some point. But what I recommend for your for loops, this is just how it's usually done. And it's a little bit easier to manage, too, if you just don't declare it until you enter your for loop. The reason it's a bit easier to manage is because you don't have all these kind of extra variables up at the top of your program that are not used for anything except for in your loop. It's just better organization. If it's only used in your loop, just declare it only in your loop. That way it only lives inside your loop. And so hopefully that makes sense. But that's the first thing. That's how it's mapped. The second thing we need is the condition. Well, here's our condition here in these parentheses. That goes straight here. You can see there's nothing different here. I'll draw an arrow connecting those two. That's the second thing. Nothing strange or different there. It's just straight up, same thing. That's the condition that the loop's going to check. And if it's still true, it does another iteration of that loop. Now, we also have the exit condition, right? We have this thing. This thing, it makes sure that at some point this condition becomes true. And it does so by incrementing the variable in this case. Well, that matches up with just the third thing. That's right here. Right? And so that's number 3. And so you can see these things in the while loop, which is kind of spread out all over the place, you just say it straight up in the for loop. You say, okay, here's the first thing, here's the second thing, here's the third thing. You just give it straight up. So it's a lot more organized, and it's much less likely to have an error. Because as some of y'all may have done if you did the checkerboard kind of challenge and assignment, if you forgot to put this exit condition, it broke your checkerboard, right? And, that's very common to do. It's very easy to forget that, right? If you do, I don't blame you at all because I do it. Everyone does it. But with the for loop, it will not even allow you to forget it. Because if you don't have something in this third spot, it yells at you and it says, hey, you're missing your third thing here. And same thing if I don't have my condition. It says, hey, you're missing a condition. You should have some kind of Boolean expression here. If you're missing your variable, it says, hey, the for loop will tell you if you're missing one of these three things. A while loop will not. So if you forget one of these three things, it may throw an error, but it won't tell you, what the problem is. And a lot of times it won't throw an error. Like if you're missing this, it won't throw an error. It'll just be stuck in infinite loop, and you have to try to figure out what's going on, what's breaking your program. And so in that case, in that sense, I really like the for loop better. It tends to be more robust. It's less likely to give you that type of error. It's less likely to get you stuck in an infinite loop. That being said, I started off by talking about while loops because I think it's easier to understand. Because if we look at how the for loop is written, that's kind of a lot to look at. So without kind of the background of a while loop, I think it's a bit overwhelming to learn right off the top. But now that we know what a while loop is and all the different parts we need, I think a for loop is the way to go from here on out. But that's basically all I want to talk about. Just that's how a while loop and a for loop works. I guess I will pull up an example. And so what I have here is some code. And so I have a variable. I'm going to show you, I have a while loop here. I'm going to show you how you can write up a for loop that is the same thing as this while loop, right? And so what does my while loop do? If I press play real quick, you see it just draws a line of circles. Cool. How did I do this? Well, I declared a variable x and diameter. So that's just the values of my circle. Right, I add one more. Int. I'm going to say y1 instead of y. You'll see y to y1 in a second. It's because when I do the for loop, it's going to be y2. But I have x, y1, and d for my circles. In my setup, I initialize these. So x is, or diameter is 50. X is half the diameter. I did that so it starts right here at the beginning edge of my window. So then I'm going to say y is equal to, I don't know. Let's say 100. Who cares, right? Whatever. Oh, y1, excuse me, y1. And then in my draw, I have this while loop here where I say, hey, while x is less than or equal to the width, draw a circle at x, y1, d, and then increase my d. Now, here in this case, I don't initialize my variable except up here in my setup. But I could very well also have it here as well. If I wanted to run that while loop every time, you could have it there as well. But okay, so we have our first thing. If you don't want it here, it's just still there in your setup. But then you have your condition. That's the second thing. Then we have our exit condition, our incrementing thing that will make sure we exit the loop at some point. So that's our third thing. So if we click play, this is what we see. I lowered it now just because I changed my y value. But you see it just draws a row of circles right there. Let's say I want to do the same thing with the for loop, but just have it a little bit lower so we can tell the difference between the two. Well, I can do that by just going for. And now I want to initialize and declare a variable. In this case, since I need to declare a new variable, right? Because like I said here, you tend to have a new variable for your for loop. You tend not to use an existing variable already in your sketch. You tend to use a variable that's made just for this for loop. The reason for this is because then this variable can only be used inside this for loop. The scope of the variable is only inside this loop, which tends to make your program a bit more robust. You can accidentally mess things up as often with that being the case. And so, okay, but what I need to do is make a new variable. I'm going to call it x2. So what I need to do, well, it's int x2. And what do I want to initialize it to be? I'm actually going to initialize it to be the same value as this, so that it starts at the very beginning of my window. So d divided by 2. That's the first thing. The second thing I need, well, let's go ahead and do that. That's my condition. It's going to do semicolon. And since I want to do the same thing as this while loop, but lower, I'm just going to copy the same condition. Copy that, paste that. Okay, very good. Now let's do our third thing. Semicolon. Well, this is my exit condition. This is how I increment my variable over time. Well, I'm just going to have the same structure as this, except it's not going to be for x anymore. It's for x2. So if I say x2 equals x2 plus d, do that, That's it. And then I have my curly braces, and then I have whatever code I want down here. In this case, I just want to draw a circle. So circle. And then instead of x, now it's x2. Oh, and I need a y value. That's why I called this y1. I also now want another y value called y2. So we'll just make that up here up top. The reason this is not my variable here in my for loop is because y2 will be constant throughout the whole loop. Because if I'm drawing a row of circles, the y never changes. The x changes, goes draw a circle here, then here, then here, then here, then here. So the x changes, but the y does not. And so it's just going to be a constant value. Since it's just constant, I can just have it declared initialized outside my loop. And so I'm going to say y2, make it equal to 300, let's say. Then, okay, now back to my for loop, circle. Going to draw it at x2, comma, y2, has the same diameter. So you can see it's very, very similar to how I wrote the while loop, except all of these parts that are kind of separated, it's all written right up front at the beginning of the for loop. And of course, if I press play, let's make sure I didn't mess anything up. Oh, I don't see anything. Oh, let's figure out why. And so, let's see. Aha, check out this condition here. I still left it at x instead of x2. And so remember, this condition should deal with this variable. So that's a mistake on my end. I just need to say x2 instead of x. Let's make sure this is right. x2 is equal to x self plus d. Very good. Okay, now let's press play again. There it is. So I just made a mistake because I used the variable from up here. And so if we think about that, the reason that didn't work is because here, x is increasing, increasing, increasing until this is false. Then I come down here. Well, if this was x, that condition is still false because the value of x was not changed. So that's why we didn't see anything. But now if I change it to x2, it's initialized to this. It checks this condition, starts off as true. It draws a circle, then it increments, la, 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 and draws all the circles, and then this eventually becomes false. So that's that. So you can see it does the exact same thing as a while loop, but it's written a bit more, more concisely, and then it's less error prone because it forces you to write all of the three things that you need up front, where you don't have to worry about, oh, did I forget my exit condition or anything? Because it won't let you forget. You have to put it in. And so that's that. That's all you need to know about a for loop. I hope that makes sense, and I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.